and for being here.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm Jessica Chen Weiss, the director of the new Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs, ACF, here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm really pleased to be joined today by three of the nation's, the world's foremost experts on the Chinese military. And this event is the first in a series of what we're calling the ACF Ideas. These are public-facing convenings on critical topics featuring a range of perspectives of policy relevance to America, China, and the future of global affairs, seeking to provide a valuable platform for debate and discussion on key issues within SAIS and the broader ACF community. Certainly today's area of focus, the Chinese military, and particularly its modernization and its capabilities, is one of incredible policy relevance and ongoing debate. The next event, looking ahead, will be a film screening and panel discussion on China's critical mineral strategy and its global implications, and that'll take place here at SAIS on April 24th, so please keep an eye out for that invitation. So on behalf of ACF, it's really a tremendous pleasure for me to now welcome first Dr. Phil Saunders, Dr. Joel Wuthnow, and Kristen Gunnis from RAND. Phil is director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. He also teaches here at SAIS and previously worked at the Monterey Institute for International Studies, where he served as director of the East Asia Nonproliferation Program and has taught courses on Chinese politics, Chinese foreign policy, and East Asian security. Joel Wuthnow is a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs, also within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at NDU, where his research areas include Chinese foreign and security policy, Chinese military affairs, US-China relations, and strategic developments in East Asia. Kristen Gunnis, we're delighted to have here with us today to discuss Phil and Joel's new book. Kristen is Associate Research Department Director and Professor of Policy Analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. Formerly, she served as the Director of the Navy Asia Pacific Advisory Group at the Pentagon, where she advised the Chief of Naval Operations on Chinese security and foreign policy trends in the Indo-Pacific. All of them collectively bring more decades of experience than any one of us do. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Phil and Joel here today to discuss their new book, China's Quest for Military Supremacy. You can see it here on the slides as well as here in the paper. I would say in the flesh, but so I'm very excited to hear them share today a little bit about their new book and some of the important questions that it raises.
Okay. Thanks much. I'm going to roam a little bit. I should say a little bit about why we did this and how we did it. So a couple of things. So first, there isn't a good book that tells you everything you need to know about the PLA in a concise, easy to read form. So there was a real gap in the literature on this, and that was noticed, including by the Indo-Pacific Command commander, who said, I want something I can give to everybody at my command to read and get smart on the PLA. And we sort of took that as a marching order. But it also comes out of teaching a course on the Chinese military at National Defense University, which Joel took the lead in developing. We've taught it there 3 times. He's taught it at Georgetown. I've taught it here at SAIS, and it's a real pleasure to see some of my former students in the audience for it. But all of this has one thing in common, trying to break down what's a really complicated, opaque topic into language, into concepts accessible to a general audience. So I have to do 2 things. First say that these are Joel and my views, not those of the US government, Department of Defense, or National Defense University. But I also want to lead kind of with the bottom line of the work, which is we see a Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army today, that's stronger and more confident than it's been at any point of its history. Yet at the same time, it has intrinsic flaws that more money, more technology just will not solve. And those are vulnerabilities that will matter if the PLA is ever ordered into combat. So that's kind of the bottom line assessment. A lot of progress, still some problems, and it's going to be hard to fix those problems. And we'll kind of elaborate. I'll go through the first couple of things and then hand it over to Joel for the final leg. Thanks. Can we go? Oh, I guess we didn't do. Okay. So one of the themes of the book is leadership and strategic patience. That I think we argue that China has been carrying out, executing a military strategy that's basically been in place since the early 90s. That has a clear focus on Taiwan. Since 1996, that has meant if you're going to deal with Taiwan militarily, that means being ready to deal with the US military. And then also a focus on shaping the regional environment. And I think our argument is they've been very disciplined and focused in carrying out that strategy and building a military that's capable of achieving these goals. A big theme in the book is Xi Jinping's role. We called it once that Xi is large and in charge, but he has been very demanding of the PLA, focused on being able to achieve the goal of being ready for a Taiwan invasion by 2027 and being a world-class force by 2049. And so there's a very clear acceleration and focus that Xi Jinping brought to his role as chair of the Central Military Commission. And he's been able to do things that previous leaders just could not. Hu Jintao talked about reorganizing the PLA, but he couldn't get it done over PLA opposition. Xi Jinping broke through that resistance. He reshaped them fundamentally in 2015 and 2016. And the result is a military that's far more joint, far more focused on operations and warfighting capability than it's ever been before. And I think one of the points we make is he's kept that as the focus. How do I build a modern, capable military that's ready to fight and win wars? But he stayed out of overseas entanglements. So we have seen a China that's more assertive in regional disputes, whether it's South China Sea, East China Sea, on the border with India, elsewhere. But they've been careful to keep that below the threshold of lethal force. They haven't got bogged down or dragged into a bunch of regional wars. And that's let them focus on modernization as a long-term goal and go about it in a very methodical manner. And some of the progress is really pretty remarkable. That when I started watching the PLA, they were flying, the Air Force was flying fighters of about 1959 design, and thousands of them. And that's what the PLA Air Force was. If you look at it today, they have world-class hardware. They have very advanced modern systems in quantity and quality that they didn't have before. And that is focused on fighting and winning informationized wars. So if you look at the Air Force, as I said, used to be flying MiG-19s. Now it's all fourth and fifth generation fighters, a lot of stealth fighters in the force. And they just showed off the next generation beyond that and have had prototypes flying earlier this year. They're working toward replacing their bomber force with a new stealth bomber design. And that will have both extended range and probably nuclear delivery capability. So that's a remarkable transition, and it's really all happened over about 30 years. The Navy has methodically experimented with a little bit better ship, and then they got ships that they liked, and they started building them in quantity. So they're now doing Luoyang 3 destroyers, the Renhai cruisers. These are very, very capable modern ships. They have all the components, the radars, the missiles that you'd expect. And some say the Renhai cruiser may be the best cruiser around. So that's a world-class system. We've also seen them making progress on their submarine force, mainly diesel submarines, but also starting to have an attack capability from those systems. Even the Army is doing very well with its modernization. I think the thing that struck me the most as we researched this, now much more heliborne, so they have their organic assets to move themselves around. And they now have long-range rockets and artillery that can reach Taiwan from the mainland. They don't have to go anywhere to provide that fire support. And then finally, one of the things that really makes the PLA stand out is they invested in conventional missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. When I started looking at that, they had an accuracy of about 1% of its range, which sort of means you fire it at a city, and if you land inside the city limits, that's a good day. Now we're looking at systems that really are precise and that can be used in a much more effective way for an informationized warfare, and also starting to incorporate things like hypersonic glide vehicles that can penetrate US missile defenses. So if you look at the hardware side, their conventional forces have come a really long way, and if not world-class, are pretty close to that. This is complemented by investments in strategic systems. And I always have to explain this, that strategic, sometimes it means nuclear, sometimes it means important. But we like to think of it as meaning strategic effects, that you can use these systems and have a big impact on the battlefield. I think the part where there's been the most change over the last 5 years is in the nuclear force. There's been a rapid expansion. If we go back to 2020, about 200 operationally fielded warheads. If we look back where we are now, it's 600. That's a huge growth in only a couple of years. And I'll just point out, the PLA hasn't explained what they are doing, why they are doing it, or how much they intend to do. But US intelligence thinks probably 1,000 deployed warheads by 2030, maybe 1,500 at some point after that. It's not just numbers. There's a shift to a nuclear triad. So still mostly ground forces. That's the backbone of their nuclear force. But now they have operationally deployed effective submarine-based weapons. And the Air Force is starting to get into the nuclear business as well. So there's a diversification there. And changes to the operational status. So we now see regularly ground missile units on nuclear alert status. We see the submarines going out on operational patrols on a regular basis. And the rocket force, which runs their missiles, talking about moving to a launch on warning strategy, which if you think what that means is if a missile is launched, they want to detect it, see where it's going to land. Is it a threat to China? What do we need to do? How are we going to react? Make a decision and launch their missiles all before that first one lands. So that's about a 30-minute timeline to do all of that stuff, well beyond the capabilities of the PLA 5 or 10 years ago. Now they look like they have the parts necessary to do that. So that's a huge change. It's not just nuclear. We have seen very effective offensive cyber capabilities. And when I say that, I mean both cyber intelligence capabilities to get inside networks and collect information, but also cyber attack capabilities. And we think of this in things like critical infrastructure to get inside the electrical power grid, or my personal favorite example in Washington, to make all the Metro cards not work anymore and screw up everybody's commute. But they have been detected in doing these kinds of things. Pre-positioning, you can argue whether that's deterrence or is it preparation for an attack, but it's a pretty sophisticated capability. And it's come a long way. It used to be you'd get this crudely worded email inviting you to just click on an attachment, and that was China's very loud, very noisy offensive cyber capability. Now it's much more sophisticated. They get inside a network, they stay there, and they've been very successful about doing this. So they've upgraded their tradecraft quite a bit and been very, very successful at it. You also have space capability. One of the things the PLA did is they looked at US military weaknesses, dependencies. One of those was on satellites, and they systematically developed the ability to attack those satellites using a direct descent anti-satellite weapon, using jamming, going up in orbit and messing with the satellites, coming at it a lot of different ways, using lasers to dazzle them. Yet at the same time, they're building their own satellite force, and they are increasingly also dependent on satellite. And then finally, electronic warfare and advanced intelligence capabilities. These are part of what you need for informationized warfare. And so I think the consequence is all this stuff we've been reading in doctrine and we're saying that's an aspirational capability. Now you see a conventional force that can do that. Now you see strategic systems that can do that. And the result is, I think if we have a US-China conflict, it's going to involve space. It's going to involve cyber, and there will be that risk or that threat of escalation to the nuclear level. That's a very different ballgame. One of the points, we think about this as US-China competition. One of the points we make in the book is they have invested a lot in the military, but it hasn't been an unbearable defense burden. So I think credible estimates beyond the official defense budget of maybe 450 billion. Some of that is for things that are just off the budget. That compares with a US defense budget of about 800 billion. But the difference is that for the United States, we're a global military. That is doing stuff all around the world. For China, that's mostly focused domestically and in the Asia-Pacific region. So it yields a very different kind of capability if you're talking about a conflict inside Asia. And I think the point we want to make here is it's a significant chunk of GDP, but about 2%. There is room to grow that higher if they feel they have to. So I would not describe this as a PLA or a China that is running all out to develop its military capabilities. Instead, they've been pretty patient. One of the things they've done is increasingly this is using indigenous systems. In the 90s, when they started to do modern military, they bought a lot of things from Russia to learn what is it like to operate a modern fighter? How do you maintain it? How do you use it? And they've gradually learned and waited for their defense industry to produce those same kinds of systems. So today it's a very modern, capable military, but it's mostly using Chinese systems. Still some Russian ones here or there, but that's a big shift. And they've started to shift from a weapons importer to a weapons exporter. If you look at defense industrial base, largest shipbuilders in the world, largest drone builders in the world, capable of producing very modern systems. And even if we look at something like demographics, absolutely China faces demographic challenges, but in our judgment, not such bad challenges that they're not going to be able to field a large military. Instead, the problem is going to be competition for technically skilled people. That's what the military wants, but those kind of people have a lot of options in Chinese society, and it's the military competes for talent, to recruit it, to retain it. Then I will hand it over to Dr. Wetton.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So Phil has given you a little bit of, it's kind of a scary story if you think about it. The amount of money they can still spend, what they've already built. I think my task here, I'm going to give you more of the reassuring side of things. In the book, we're trying to portray sort of a balanced view of the PLA, its strengths as well as its weaknesses. I think that when we try to evaluate its weaknesses, though, it's not so much anymore about money or hardware or capabilities, what they can do. It's really about sort of the organizational defects that they can't reform or they can't spend their way out of. And so kind of the number one thing that we talk about here in the book is like kind of the civil military relations in China, the kind of significant lack of trust between the civilian leadership and the PLA. And we just see this all the time. It goes back through history, Mao not trusting his generals, abortive coups, and so on. 1989, parts of the PLA more or less saying they're not going to follow orders. But the problem of late has been significant corruption. And so, kind of what we analyze is that the reason for this is that the PLA is very autonomous. They've been given a huge amount of discretion, authority in China. They just don't simply have the checks and balances that we have in terms of the legal system, the media, and so on to control the military. So they've been kind of in some way left to their own devices. Xi Jinping came in, he tried to get them under control, did a lot of anti-corruption work, but he wasn't really able to solve the problem because he had to respect their autonomy for them to remain loyal to him. And so what we see for the last couple of years have been just repeated instances of very senior members of the PLA somehow acting against the party's interests, mainly by corruption. And we see this, kind of the folks here on the slide, Li Shangfu, Miao Hua, wrapped up in scandals. And these are Xi Jinping's own appointees. So the question is, not only are they corrupt, but what are they building that might not work? What information are they giving him that might not be true? And how confident can he be that he's getting the full picture of the PLA what are they going to, do in a war? How capable are they actually going to be, given the fact that he knows that they tend to prevaricate, not tell him everything, and spin things. And so I think the trust is really kind of the key issue that they face that we have less of in our system. So the party wants to be in control of the PLA. It's never really fully gotten there, but it aspires to do it. And because of that, they've put into place and retained over the last almost 100 years this Leninist trapping of control. So this is very different from our system or really any Western military. You still have in the PLA political commissars that go all the way down through the grassroots. You have party committees, you have a massive amount of political indoctrination. And if you look at this, this is critical for the party to feel as though they're in control, but it's inefficient and it's cumbersome. If you think about, just operational decision making and how they would fare, in a conflict where you have to have people who are in charge, able to make quick and controversial, bold decisions. That's kind of bread and butter for our system, right? You talk about something like mission command. You want to empower people so that they can make tough choices in modern war. But in the PLA, they just don't have an organizational culture that allows them to do that. And so that's something they've retained. They haven't really weakened it. Under Xi Jinping, they've actually strengthened it because he's Mr. Party. He wants the party to be in control of all these different power centers in the country. And the PLA is really no exception to this. And so you've traded some level of confidence that you can control these guys against kind of operational efficiency, which could disadvantage them in a future conflict. So those are a couple of the organizational defects. Then you look at sort of the global posture of the PLA. They talk about becoming a world-class force, but they're not world-class today in the sense that they can operate across the world. In fact, really, if you look beyond the first island chain, they only have about 3,000 or 4,000 troops. We have hundreds of thousands, hundreds of bases. They don't have any of that. I think the reason is because of this strategic discipline, the focus on the near abroad, Taiwan, the regional disputes. They have, in a sense, smartly put their investments where it matters most to them, which is in the region and at home, right? If you're talking about preserving the party's power. But they haven't gone global in the sense that they could have. So they haven't really done military alliances. They don't forward deploy thousands of troops as we do. They only have a single base in Djibouti that's a very small base, not designed for much beyond, sort of non-traditional security. And so what they don't have is the ability to really shape the global security environment as we do. So I'll give Phil some credit here. He's done a lot of work on military diplomacy, and this is something that they do. They have military exercises and diplomats and, engagements and port calls, and they publicize this a lot, so it looks like a huge level of effort, but it's not really combat potential. It's really quite far from it. And so you really have to think in the future, well, it would take a lot for them to shift. They'd have to agree to do military alliances. They'd have to get over this aversion to overseas basing. They would have to solve some of the near abroad problems potentially to unlock some of the potential to go farther afield. But even if they did, they would have to make a political decision to want to be a global military. And they haven't really made that decision yet today. So what does this kind of all add up to? I think, the focus of a lot of, people here in DC just this last week with the major exercises going across the Taiwan Strait is what does this add up to for China's major target of this military modernization? Taiwan, I think, if you asked us this 3 years ago, what has happened over the last week would be quite shocking and it would be headline news, but now it's not. Now it's sort of a minor news story. It's sort of baked into the, the tempo of PLA operations. So they have dozens of jets streaming across the midline of the Taiwan Strait, but no one really notices that anymore. So you're going to continue to see this, what we call sort of gray zone coercion. It's psychological warfare. It's meant to undermine Taiwan's sense of confidence in their own capabilities. But I think we're less we don't make as strong a prediction about active military operations against Taiwan. I think because for the PLA, there are still a number of really critical weaknesses, including the lack of transportation, including the difficulties of actually crossing and operating on Taiwan, but especially the prospect that the United States would intervene for Taiwan. And so there are a lot of variables there that a cautious leader like Xi Jinping can't really fully account for or control. And so we think the time is still not necessarily on the PLA's side. They're making a lot of progress, but we do see, efforts by Taiwan supported by the United States to maintain deterrence. So I think we're actually less alarmist in this book than you see sometimes in the public discourse, especially around the critical date of 2027, which is a milestone for the PLA, but certainly not an operational target. So I think we certainly expect that to continue. Look, over the long run, I think, they're not just looking at 2027, they're looking farther. And so, kind of the title or the implication of the book is, well, what does it really mean for them to become a world-class military? And so they've set this 2049 date. They're thinking certainly long-term, and they do have these advantages in industrial capacity and in leadership commitment to build up the military into a strong warfighting force. And we're going to see that persist well beyond 2027. But that doesn't necessarily imply some sort of, direct military, attack on Taiwan in the next couple of years. And so we think that competition is just going to evolve in one way or another over the next couple of decades. We don't see them thinking that the 2030s or 40s is a period of intense difficulty. They seem optimistic that they can leverage those advantages in money, in manufacturing capacity, in commitment to really, pose challenges. So we don't see them boxed into some near-term decision on using force. That being said, again, some of the problems that they face are sort of endemic. You can't buy your way out of these things. So, the human capital, the trust, the organizational defects, these are all challenging. Eventually, we'll get to the post-Xi era. And, whoever that leader will be, it will be a civilian, probably someone who doesn't have much connection to the PLA. And most likely that person will face a lot of the same challenges that Xi has faced. That's really bedeviled their ability really to get to where they want to be by these different milestones. And so we end on, a little bit of an optimistic note that, while they're making progress, they're still constrained by a lot of these issues, and that'll be true almost regardless whoever is in power. So I'm going to turn it over there and listen to Christian. Christian.
Share the book apart.
No, I'm not going to do that. Actually, I wanted to start by really commending both of you for an extremely comprehensive and important piece of work. It's a particularly uncertain time with increasingly complex environment in the Indo-Pacific and an ongoing debate in the United States and the West in general about how to counter Chinese aggression and coercion. And as we know, this is a really complicated challenge to deal with, but it's critical to start with as full an understanding of the PLA as possible. And, in terms of its modernization, its training, its investments, and also its own analysis of itself. And that's something that's really important to understand for us to best figure out how to posture and plan and work with allies and partners. So this is a really timely book to have published right now, and having worked in the China studies and PLA field for many years, I think it's a great compilation of a lot of the foundational research that's been done over the last decade. So anyway, thank you for writing it and publishing it. Since you've already gone over the highlights of the book, I thought I'd just focus on a few points and questions that have been coming up in my own research, as well as with discussions with policymakers and colleagues. And a lot of it actually deals with Joel's sort of more reassuring part of the presentation and some of the endemic challenges that the PLA is still facing. But one of the questions that I'm often asked now is essentially whether the PLA can adapt to the fog of war. And, that seems to be a key question for decision makers in DOD who are looking at how to posture and plan. And when people think of this, they naturally think of a Taiwan contingency, not whether the PLA can prosecute the type of joint campaign that they would need to in order to prevail in a Taiwan conflict, but whether and how much the inherent challenges of the PLA structure and the CCP system that you mentioned in your presentation will degrade the warfighting effectiveness and efficiency. And so that is, I think, a key question that's happening right now. And so I'm thinking of things like Joel mentioned, political imperatives versus operational effectiveness, the CCP's desire for tight control over the PLA, and the demands of modern warfare for a more devolved approach to decision making, or other aspects of organizational culture that undermine military reforms necessary to operate in a high intensity conflict environment. And this includes corruption and the effect on civil military relations that you talked about, and Xi Jinping's ability to trust his top commanders. And there's been so much emphasis put on the PLA's advancements in strike capabilities, number of ships they have, their advances in PLA Air Force and in space-based capabilities that Phil talked about. that I think this organizational culture piece is sometimes not as fully addressed as well as it could be. And it's a significant aspect of being able to answer that question of whether the PLA can adapt to the fog of war. And I also think this further bumps up against another topic that is being focused on right now about the PLA's adoption of AI. I hate to bring up the AI into this, but it is something that's being talked about right now, and how that might affect their CTO and decision making. And we know they're pursuing that capability. We know that they write about it. They're interested in it. In some quarters, they might think this might be a magic wand that can fix some of the intractable C2 issues that they've been trying to reform since Xi Jinping announced the 5 Incapables in 2015. So anyway, I know you already talked about some of those aspects, but I'd be curious if you could pull on that thread a little more. And then a second question that I wanted to highlight is the balance between the PLA's focus on modernization and training for the regional contingencies versus expanding its footprint abroad. As you point out, the PLA lags behind China's global interests in terms of permanent basing, infrastructure, and supporting logistics and C4ISR systems. And they're definitely limited by lack of allies and partners. So while the PLA might be able to project pockets of force for specific events over a short duration, they're still a ways away from being able to sustain combat forces over a longer period of time. But I think the question is how much the Chinese leadership will be willing to invest more substantially to build out the PLA's capacity to project power overseas, or whether they'll continue to rely on other levers of power, such as building influence through economic and diplomatic measures through the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, for example, or the Belt and Road Initiative, to increase the military's footprint in strategic locations or with specific partners where they have interests. And as you said, this is dependent on the state of US-China strategic competition, Taiwan and other security concerns that are closer to home. But I do think the drivers for the PLA to continue to build out its presence globally and its expeditionary capabilities are still there. And I wonder, how you think that might strike that balance. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great comments, Chris. And, we talk a bit about, sort of on the first question, this has to do with, well, you're a Leninist military, you're a bit hidebound in your structure, but, the pace of conflict is steadily increasing. And so how do you square the circle? And I mean, I do think there are some voices in the PLA who look to AI and so-called intelligentization as, if not a magic wand, as maybe perhaps a mental crutch to just sort of get through this dilemma. There are voices who want to use technology and especially by AI to create this, sort of complete and perfect common operational picture that commanders at a very senior level will have, and they can sort of move things around on a touchscreen and immediately control the war without having to go through all of the mess of the organization down throughout the ranks. But I think, that can be a very misleading picture for them to give to senior leaders as if things are really so simple. I mean, the fact is that, if they're going to rely more on AI and just electronic systems in general, those are vulnerable. And I think, smarter people in the PLA know them to be vulnerable to manipulation and distortion and electronic warfare, et cetera. And so, it's not a perfect solution. And then there's a question of, well, how much can you really micromanage from the center? They're building this thing right now called Beijing Military City, which is like 10 times larger than the Pentagon, as if you have this nerve center that can control everything. But I think warfare is not so simple. I think, people all throughout down to the grassroots need to be able to take initiative and seize opportunities. And there will be friction, there will be conflicting information, opportunities and risks that have to be assessed at all different levels. So if people are telling people like Xi Jinping, AI will solve your problem, I think I'd be hard pressed if I were Xi to actually believe it. And so that's kind of my response on that. I don't know if you want to take the second. Or Bill.
I'll just add to that. Part of it is a lot of what they do to coordinate is to have a plan. And you coordinate the plan, you practice the plan, and especially for joint operations or integrated joint operations, that's a way of getting everybody on the same page. You know what you're supposed to do, you've trained to do it, you're ready to do it. The problem is, what happens when you have to change the plan? What happens when you go off plan? What is your ability to adapt dynamically to what's going on and respond to it in ways that you didn't expect? An AI can't necessarily do that for you because it does what it's programmed and trained to do. And that's where I think some of the weaknesses in the commanders really potentially come to the fore. If you relied on everybody knowing what to do as part of the plan, and that's no longer operative, what's your ability to adapt, to improvise, and to keep everybody on the same page as you do that? I think that's where the challenges really are going to be, and AI doesn't necessarily solve it. To speak to the second point, I think a lot depends on what happens in Asia. That if they solve the Taiwan problem, they can look further afield. If they solve some of their maritime territorial disputes, they can look further afield. And conversely, if those things are all still big problems for them, that's going to make it harder to do so. I would add, I guess, two things. I think the Navy is the force that's most interested in that global power projection role, and they look at the need to protect sea lines of communications coming from the Middle East, coming from Africa, going around India that they're not friends with, going through the Malacca Strait, which is a choke point. So I think the Navy is the service most interested in that. And interestingly, it's going to take most of its capabilities with it when it goes. Air Force can't do that. Rocket Force can't do that, but the Navy can. And then the second point is the PLA is less eager, I think, to get involved in a lot of overseas bases and a lot of overseas presence as a means of pursuing or protecting China's national interests. They see a great potential to get bogged down there, to get involved in regional wars. When we pulled out of Afghanistan, there were some voices saying, well, China will maybe go stabilize them. And in my contacts with the Chinese, they want no part of that. They just see it as very complicated politically and very hard to do. So I think they hope to provide security assistance to partners, use private security, use a bunch of other means to stabilize situations and protect their interests. The military instruments pretty far down that list in terms of what they want to do.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that point. Yeah, I mean, I do think in the future you can have non-military solutions to military problems overseas. And, for them, part of the problem would be, well, how can they frustrate US military interventions that they oppose? And, one way to do that would be through military means, but then you can also do it through diplomatic and economic means as well. So if you look at US military interventions in the past, we rely on access, basing, overflight in countries where China has significant influence. If you look at, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan back, 25 years ago, we had to operate through Central Asian air bases. And now China is, the dominant trade and investment partner of those. So the point is, if they oppose a US military action, they could potentially lean on, on those tools. And that also has implications for US-China conflict itself. If we might say that, our trump card is being able to hold China's trade at risk in the far seas, right? But China doesn't necessarily have to oppose that blockade through a naval response or an Air Force response. They could oppose it through a diplomatic and economic response. How are we going to be able to undertake a far seas blockade if we're not able to operate out of allied or partner ports? And if China opposes that counter blockade, then they have other tools they could potentially use. And so they have solutions. It's not as though they're leaving themselves totally vulnerable to whatever we want to do as a global military. But that doesn't require them to build a symmetrical military tool to respond to it. And that's quite cost effective. And it allows them, again, to focus on their main priorities, which are closer to home.
That was terrific, all three of you. So before we turn to the audience for questions, I want to use the prerogative as the host to ask one question, which is where I think the conversation has started to go. But that in Washington, it is common to hear that China seeks to displace, if not replace, the United States as the globally preponderant power. And yet, and sometimes I think there's an effort to look at China's increasing efforts to develop bases beyond Djibouti as evidence of that global intent to dominate. And so I'm curious whether you see in the investments that China has made to date and the capabilities that it has, as well as where the leading edge of future capabilities, how does that add up for you in terms of your assessment of China's intentions today and kind of the pace of change should they grow in the future? I think a lot of what you've said just now about some of the reticence in the PLA. Is that shared, do you think, by the leadership, or are they pushing back against their own? Is it an internal kind of debate or a struggle, not an overt struggle, but nonetheless a subject of some contention? And where do you see that internal discussion going?
It's a great question. It's hard to answer. I think so part of this comes out of what was called the New Historic Missions in 2004. So Hu Jintao gave these to the PLA. The PLA helped write them, because that's the best thing, is when you write your own guidance, it makes it a lot easier to get to do what you want to do. And that called for giving the PLA a role in protecting China's economic development. And that is kind of an enabling condition. That implies protection of sea lines of communications, overseas investment, overseas workers. And I think the PLA wanted that in there because it's a hook for some capabilities that especially the Navy wanted, but also the Air Force. If you've got to potentially go get Chinese citizens overseas, well, you need a capable transport force. You need a force that can go around the world and get people and get them out of there. And that's also a way for the PLA politically to show the Chinese public, well, here's some of what you're getting from military capability. We can go to Libya and get people out. We can go to Sudan and get people out when it's needed. So I think there's a sense that this is a useful justification for some of these power projection capabilities, yet also in the PLA an awareness of just how big some of the challenges are. And I think, you know, the Navy is out in front on this. Other services, the Space Force needs to have some overseas locations to operate its satellites, and that's kind of something that they have to do. But I'm not sure I see that from the rest of the PLA, from the Army, from the Air Force, a real sense that they're itching to have overseas bases and expand that presence. Joel, you might have a.
No, I actually have the exact same take. I'm just going to say it in a little different way. I mean, basically, my view is that, you know, yes, they are building tools of power projection that we can't ignore. I mean, if you think about it, they're building 4 or 5, you know, carrier strike groups. They're building, you know, like large deck amphib ships that can transport hundreds of troops and, you know, tons of equipment overseas. And this doesn't mean that suggests an intention to displace the United States as a predominant global military power. And in fact, I think they're pursuing a smarter strategy, which is to say, look, you know, our resources are limited as a country. They're prodigious, but they're still limited. Where should we put those? I mean, this is the art of strategy, and they're putting them on the problems that matter most to them, which is the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the territorial disputes they have with India, the potential contingency with North Korea. They have multiple problems they have to address, behind which, you know, in most cases is a potential U.S. intervention. And that's really where they're putting the primary focus of their effort. And so, you know, that's really the intention, I think. And so if our national defense strategy says they intend to be, you know, sort of the dominant regional military power, meaning that they can contest any U.S. action and achieve their ends, I probably would agree with that. But when you go a step further and say they intend to be the dominant military power globally at some point in the future, I don't know why that would make sense for them. I think, in fact, you can almost argue counterintuitively that they would prefer that the U.S. take on that role. You know, why wouldn't they want us to be bogged down in the Middle East or bogged down in Europe, you know, wasting, you know, trillions of dollars and not putting that into Asia where it's of greater use? And so, you know, if we say that we're almost a global policeman, why would China want to step into that role to the extent it would actually atrophy their own capabilities to solve higher order interests for the party? And so if our strategy goes to that leap, I think that's more of an imaginative leap that's out of touch with how they're thinking about it.
Let me add, oh, Chris, Krista was reaching for the microphone. I'll just add a quick thing and then I'll pass it on. But to try to be more responsive, I mean, I think we've responded, but what would be an indicator that kind of change? And so if you look at this Beijing military city, and if there is a floor dedicated to global operations, right now they have an overseas operations office that's not that big, not that capable of commanding. If they established if they built that out so there really is a command force focused on overseas operations, and that's what they do all the time, is there the equivalent of a global command that takes responsibility for that? that plans to execute it. Do we see security assistance become a much bigger priority for China overseas? Maybe in the anti-terrorism realm, maybe in stability maintenance. And I think interestingly today, if you see the United States and Europe pulling back from places like Africa, well, China has very significant economic interests with Africa. Is that something where they might step up despite this wariness and these concerns? So those would be things that I would see as an indicator that the attitude's changing a little bit.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think China's lack of allies and partners is a real inhibitor also because, you can have a fleet of long-range transport aircraft, but you need some place to land them between China and Djibouti, for example. And right now, it's really hard for them to find those places. And so what they've been doing is, like what they're doing in Cambodia at the Ream Naval Base, where they invest in building out infrastructure and then they get some access in return. But that's not really going to solve the issue of if you were truly to become a global force that could go anywhere and also sustain combat overseas. So I think that another indicator would be China's approach to partnerships and, doing things a little bit differently so that they would have more than just sort of token access to places.
Wonderful. Okay, now it's your turn. So when I acknowledge you, why don't you say who you are and then just so that everybody knows where you're coming from. Please.
My name is Geert van Brandt. I'm a SAIS alum, 74. And wonder, the United States since World War II has been in many conflicts as, the policeman of the world, as you call it. How many wars has the United States won decisively? And maybe you can list them since World War II.
And
So, we lost
I'm tempted to quote Joe and Lai and say it's too early to tell, which is his famous quote.
After 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan and all these other places, I mean, your silence alone.
Well, I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of the book.
If we are smarter and say, why would we get bogged down in so many conflicts and wars that have never ended decisively? And why don't we focus on what's really important to us, commerce with the world, instead of being the policeman of the world, and our neighborhood, South China, and the sea and Taiwan. It sounds pretty intelligent to me.
Well, it's a strategic approach, although I will also note that if you look at the PLA writings, they think they've won every war they've been in. So,
well, so do the Americans, obviously.
thank you. Next question. Yes, here.
My name is Ted Tyler. I'm with Stand Together Trust. My question is, do you foresee any kind of possibility for a civilian vice chairman to be appointed to the PLA by Xi, maybe run up to this party Congress or the 2031 or 32? But yeah, just your thoughts on that.
I mean, there's always the possibility. I mean, Xi Jinping was the civilian vice chairman for two or 3 years or so. I mean, I think the problem is that he hasn't designated a successor. And once you designate a successor, you're maybe not quite a lame duck, but you're not completely, so I think he's had some reasons why he hasn't done that yet. And he seems intent on staying around as long as possible. But I think he wants to be in charge of the PLA. He doesn't want someone to be kind of taking the reins. He looked at the messy transition, I think, between Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, where Hu was never really fully in charge because Jiang stayed on. And so he seems to be thinking, well, I want to take the reins for as long as possible, and then whatever happens next. But then the problem with that, though, is that what happens after he departs and under what circumstances. If he doesn't appoint a successor in training, then he has someone who comes in as a successor who is untrained in this role. And so that person might not know the PLA as well as that person could. And I'll just say one more point, which is that 2022 at the last party Congress, he had 7 people on the Central Military Commission, including himself. And now he has 4, half the uniformed officers assuming He Weidong is part of that, are gone. And he hasn't even resuscitated the military side. And so things are a mess. Like they are chaotic for him right now. So, you know, best case, there's a smooth transition, but he doesn't even have generals to advise him right now.
I want to add just a little piece. I mean, the book tries to be a general overview of the PLA, and we do draw on research of a lot of our colleagues. But we've also got original research in it. And one of the areas was delving a little bit into this. And I think what we discovered is that during that transition from Hu Jintao, Joel's right, a very messy transition from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao. Jiang stayed on for 2 years as chair of the Central Military Commission. But I think we've discovered that when Hu Jintao was leaving, he did a number of things to help position Xi Jinping to have more control. And those include enshrining the principle of the so-called chairman responsibility system, that the chairman makes the decisions, not his advisors. He gave Xi Jinping, we are told, a role in picking the military members of the Central Military Commission. So Xi got to pick the people that he would be working with in a way that Hu Jintao did not. Those were all Jiang Zemin's people. And of course, he retired on time. And he left the political stage, and he left Xi Jinping alone and in charge of the military. So those were a number of things that happened to position Xi Jinping better vis-a-vis the military. I think that's the question when it's time for Xi Jinping to think about getting off the stage. Is he going to do similar things to give his successor the best possible start with the military or not?
Terrific. Here.
Hi, my name is Kathy Tai. I'm from Center for International Private Enterprise. So I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is, so in the past, my organization and my team, we have been tracking China's large BRI investments around the world. And so we never really pay special attention to port building, just like we treat any other infrastructure. And then so the goal really is about driving transparency of all these projects. But then with the most recent Panama port, in terms of, operating, running, that sort of discussion and debate and back and forth between our administration and also the deal seems to be stalled right now because of the kind of disapproval from the top leadership in China. I think that does highlight the security implication of ports. And that also kind of went beyond kind of before our more basic understanding of the potential kind of dual use, especially in the time of, crisis or conflict. And I think as you rightly point out about the port in Cambodia, right, that was also something that people kind of highlighted before. And plus the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, and then the potential, port operation in Maldives. So there is potentially a plan to kind of connect it, the route for strategic reasons. And so my question is, have you seen from, all your research, the book talk about kind of the combination or the crossroad or intersection between kind of the BRI infrastructure plan? Because in the past, our thought was just, it's industrial of overcapacity. It's more, commercial reasons. But now that we see potentially more and more, dual use type of functionality between, different infrastructures, then have you seen any sort of military side of writing or policy guidance, to kind of further consolidate this sort of plan? So that's kind of the first question. The second question. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Well, so first I want to cite the work of Isaac Carden and Wendy Latort. Isaac is an adjunct professor here. They did some great work on this, and we got a chance to see some of it in draft and comment on it. In particular, their international security article, which I used for my classes, both my maritime security and PLA classes. I think I made them read it. And I think they do a very nice job of laying out the issues. One of the concerns is that Chinese companies, whether they are Hong Kong Chinese companies or private Chinese companies or state-owned Chinese companies, have to get along with the party. And sometimes there are legal things that the party can lean on them for intelligence support or other things like that. So that's just something that has to be a consideration. And they do operate a number of ports around the world. Some of them are Chinese invested, some of them are Chinese owned, some of them are Chinese operated. That gives a certain value. It gives absolutely an intelligence value. You know what the shipping is, where it's going. That's very valuable information. It potentially gives the ability to influence that in a crisis situation. So let's say the US is flowing forces to the Middle East and it's going through a number of commercial ports. Chinese companies would know that. They might be in a position to say, well, the US port, yeah, you'll get refueled, when we get around to it. And that might not be for, a couple days. So I think there is a certain amount of intelligence value that cannot be denied. There is the potential to influence the flow of forces. PLA Navy ships have sometimes used these ports commercially for replenishment. This has been especially true of the Counter-Piracy Task Force, but not only them. That to me is not such a big deal. But the real questions are how they might use them in a wartime situation. And are the political relationships between China and the host countries of the port strong enough that they will let the Navy use them and operate from them in a combat setting? And I think there's some reasons to be skeptical of that. Just from a legal matter, it turns a country from a neutral into a combatant. And that means, you're part of the conflict and you can be targeted, you can be attacked. I think countries will be reluctant to do that. And they'll be reluctant to do it for the United States as well. That's partly why alliances matter so much, because there's a political foundation for a much deeper thing. And then the last point I would say on that is that sometimes there's an overlap between where the PLA goes and where Chinese invested ports are. It's hard for me to make too much of that, because where are the Chinese investment ports? It's on the main trading routes. And that's where the ships are, that's where the money is, that's where the oil goes. So you can say that's strategic locations and you wouldn't be wrong. You can say that's economic reasons and you wouldn't be wrong about that either. So it's hard to disentangle how much of it is really specifically for military purposes. The Chinese Navy is well aware of this investment. They hope to leverage it in lots of ways. But their ability to do so, particularly in those high-end situations, is a little bit questionable, at least to me. Kristen, do you want to?
I guess I would just add that. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I guess I would just add that some of these dual use ports can't even really host a large number of ships or anything like that. So it's not, I'm not saying they couldn't use it and they couldn't leverage it, but again, just to footstop Phil's point, in a conflict, there would be limited utility to some of them. And so that's just an added rationale for looking at it as, commercial with maybe some military use, but in a high-end conflict, it would be hard to envision it.
Right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we will let you get your sandwiches, and then you can more informally ask questions. I know we've held you for a while without food, so yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm a student of Professor Saunders. My question was whether there is a plan in Washington or among allied countries, or what recommendations you would have around if the PLA's sort of strategic patience continues indefinitely, and we see the sort of salami slicing that's happening right now.
Okay. Let me paraphrase the question to the one that I want to answer. That's a classic technique. So the question sort of is, what if we see this trend continue, that the PLA continues gray zone tactics, salami slicing, nothing so big as to provoke an overt conflict, but gradually strengthening its position in Asia? And then how does the US respond to that? And it's a challenge in some way. That's why they're in the gray zone, because it's hard to respond to it. It's hard to justify the use of force in response to it. I guess I have two thoughts on that. The first is that to some degree, you've already seen the response. which is to step up security assistance in the Indo-Pacific to help countries build their maritime domain awareness, to help build their Coast Guard and other capabilities, to have more of an ability to stand up to and resist this. And then in the US military terms, to be more active in the region, to have a more regular presence, both occasionally of Coast Guard, but usually of the US military, and to try to use that presence as a demonstration of US capability and will to remain involved in the region, sometimes directly challenging China, sometimes giving heart to allies and partners that they're not alone in this, and occasionally, more direct support for countries like the Philippines when China's really leaning on them. The US has at times got involved. So that's kind of you've already seen that response. This administration is talking about more of a focus on the Indo-Pacific in terms of forces, which I think would enable some of those things. But as Joel said, and Kristen said too, we depend heavily on allies and partners to have access, and they mostly want us actively engaged in the region. And when China says, those Americans, they're just troublemakers, that's not how most of the region sees us. They see it as a stabilizing force and want to support that. So I think that's kind of the response that you've seen. I think, the tougher question is, can China get where it wants to go staying in the gray zone? Because I think the hope is eventually they'll keep putting on pressure, and eventually countries will tire of this. They'll give up their claims. They'll let China have what it wants. But as you know very well from class, it's easy to keep maritime disputes going, and it's hard to conclusively resolve them without using force. So I'm not sure China can stay in the gray zone and achieve control over all this territory. I think that's a tough thing to do.
So I'll put this more in the specific context of Taiwan, because this is happening this week. They have, an indisputable gray zone challenge from China, and yet they're also worried about, an actual war. I think in a sense that the gray zone campaign China is doing right now is very smart, because what that's doing in Taiwan is encouraging people to think that they need, big surface ships and Coast Guard ships and fighter jets and so on to compete in the gray zone, because they still have to defend their territorial airspace and, resist the Coast Guard coming up close to them and so on. And that's sucking money away from actual, wartime efforts to defeat a PLA invasion. And so that's something we keep encouraging them, don't get so sucked up in these large legacy prestige items that are your services want. And now China's giving those services a perfect rationale to make those arguments. And so that's taking a little bit of the eye off the prize, which is actually deterring aggression that will actually harm, potentially, pose an existential threat to your society. And so I think, for Taiwan, they do have a legitimate argument that they have to be able to defend those maritime, waterways and, oppose, boarding of their ships and so on. They have to do that, but then they also, I think should not lose sight of, the key deterrent question. And so for me, the question is, well, how do they strike that balance? And I don't believe they can strike a balance with the small amount of defense spending they're doing right now, which, it takes like heroic effort to get them from like 2.1% to 2.2% of GDP. But that's not sufficient. You have a pretty significant economy. You can raise defense spending in such a way that allows you to buy a lot more of the equipment, meaning the anti-ship missiles, the sea mines, et cetera, you need to deter, while also maintaining readiness of your, conventional platforms that you need to oppose gray zone coercion. You must spend more money to do it, and you cannot count on the United States to give you everything you need, because I think that argument here is becoming increasingly challenged too.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking Phil and Joel and Kristen for such an illuminating and insightful conversation. Please help yourself to food outside and come back in and stick around we have a room for about 15 more minutes. So. That's right. And do take a copy of the flyer on your way out to buy the book. Thank you all.